sailing for just a moment, not back to cruise ships, but back to sailing ships, like the, good old-fashioned sailing ships that had sails and stuff. I'm kidding. No, they had wooden hulls, and one of the great markers that I love to see, and I like, kind of that 19th century, kind of motif. I've read, there's a series of books by Patrick O'Brien called Master and Commander, is kind of the name of the series, or the Opry Maturin series, depending. There's only 20 novels in the series, so you can really go to town, and you can read a lot of Patrick O'Brien for as long as you want. But one of the distinctives that you get in this is it's all wooden sailing ships, and of course they're military ships. And so what do you have on military ships that are wood? Cannon, right, because what else are you going to shoot? If you're a military ship and you have a wooden hull, you have cannon, or just the part of it. And so in any time you have wooden sailing ships, and you have nations, you have fleets, and you have naval battles. Now, back in the day, naval battles were kind of a close-in, boisterous, booming, blood, guts, sheer terror kind of an encounter. We don't really get that so much anymore, because these days all of our naval weapons are designed to be nearly global. Many of our ships that ply the seas today can reach just about any part of the world, and if they can't get there, they get closer, and that's why they're on a boat. And so naval warfare has changed. But back in the day, naval warfare was just this loud, boisterous kind of thing. And what you would have, because you're dealing with a sailing ship, you can't just go where you want to go. The great thing with a motor is you turn the motor on, you go faster or slower, and you turn. But you go where you want to go, because you're not dependent upon the tide and the currents and the wind to get you there. Excuse me. But on a sailing ship, you're contingent on all those. You have a tiller. You can kind of point the ship where you're hoping it's going to go, but current plays a factor in where your ship actually goes. And wind plays a factor on if your ship actually goes and where your ship actually goes. A lot of you have a lot of lead time, because when you're moving at 5 miles an hour, it takes a while to get there. It's like those movies where you get the slow-mo, the two people running to each other, and they start doing this, and like 3 minutes later, they get there, they've covered like 8 feet. That's kind of how it is in a naval battle in the old days. It was just, you have a lot of time to close that gap. But during that time, both ships are maneuvering. They are trying to grab the wind and the current and get into the most advantageous position in which to have this fight. And typically, one ship or the other, depending on the wind and waves and weather and all that good stuff, would actually have an advantage. It could get into a good firing position first. And so what they would do is, as soon as they got into this position that they wanted to be in relative to the other ship, they would give them a broadside. Have you heard that term before? Everybody knows what a broadside is? A broadside, if your ship can handle it. A broadside is, push out all guns and you shoot everything at once. If your ship can't handle it, they did what was called a rolling broadside, and they would fire every gun on that side in sequence. So it would be boom, 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 boom. So it depends on how tough your ship is, because you figure the recoil on 40 guns shooting simultaneously is a bit much. And you could sink your own ship if you weren't careful. And so you would get in, and they would fire a broadside at the other ship. Now, the advantages of this were many. First of all, 20 to 40 odd cannonball coming at you leaves holes. It just does. It's going to make a mark somewhere. Add to that, the other ship is still trying to get into position. You only have one crew, and so you've got people manning the sails that need to be manning a gun, and they can either do one or the other, but not both. And so you're at a personnel advantage, because you got people who are still trying to drive the ship, not shoot guns, and that's advantageous if you're actually shooting. Plus, if you take out a few of their guns in the process, or a few of their people in the process, you actually reduce the firing capacity they have to fire back at you. And so you get the broadside out, and the other ship, once they get into position, would get what they can, and then they just kind of slam it out, duke it out, But if you get that first broadside, it gives you a really big advantage. Now, like I said, we don't really get that so much in modern Navy. I know the ships have guns on them. They don't use them that often because, if you have an Aegis missile on there that can get 1,000 miles, why would you get within a mile so you can shoot it? Because it's a heck of a lot safer back there. And so that's what they do. And the cannons, the guns they have on most of your battleships and destroyers, what few guns they have, they're launching this, the shells that are the size and weight of a Volkswagen Bug. So, when you start shooting, that you really are throwing a lot of metal around. And they do it occasionally. You'll see it, and you can Google it, and it's great because when they shoot, just the boom from the gun actually depresses the water under the boat. And so you get this great recoil, you get a projectile, you get flames and smoke and water, and it's great. And the most visual thing I can think about for a broadside in a modern context, how many of you remember the movie Battleship? Awesome movie. It was a great movie. You should definitely go see it. But in the movie Battleship, a battleship is facing aliens because why wouldn't you? And but the great thing, one scene, they're coming in this vintage World War II battleship, and they got all the guns pointed and primed and ready to go, and cruising, and all of a sudden they drop anchor, swing the boat around, kind of unrealistically. I think they'd have broken the back of the ship. But they drop the anchor, they swing the boat around, and they give them a whole broadside right into the alien ship. And it's just this massive... And it does what broadsides are supposed to do, inflicts massive casualties, and it gives them a great advantage going into the fight, doing a lot of damage in a lot of different places, and really gives you an edge on the way in. And so that's very cool. It may not seem terribly relevant, but it actually is. As we think about God's at war, and we go to the book of Exodus, and let me have you go there, the book of Exodus chapter 7 this morning, and we're going to talk about the first of these plagues. The first of the plagues that God brought upon Egypt was very much like a broadside. It was God having the initiative. It was God having the advantage, turning around and shooting everything he had in one shot and doing a lot of damage very quickly and very suddenly to the Egyptians. Now, one of the things that we said last week was to go back because I foolishly attempted to preach through 6.5 chapters. 30 minutes. I got 45, and I'm not sure how well I covered 6.5 chapters. So I would encourage you, if you didn't yet, still go back and read through those because those chapters are really critical. But what we see in those first 6.5 chapters of Exodus is this disagreement over lordship that really emerges. Because Pharaoh, looking at the Hebrew people, Pharaoh thinks that they are his people and they serve him. And God rather asserts that they are his people and that they serve him. And that kind of sets up the real crisis that we're going to see play out now over the next several chapters in Exodus. Because when God asserts his ownership or his lordship over the people, what is Pharaoh's response? His response is, who is the Lord that I should obey him? That's a very important question because God is going to answer that question in very clear terms so that at the end of this exchange, Pharaoh will no longer have to wonder who is the Lord that he should obey him. He may not like obeying him, but he'll know he's the Lord and he probably should. And so this becomes a very important question. We ask this question, and as long as you're asking it in a exploratory fashion, that's a good question. Pharaoh was not asking it in an exploratory way. Pharaoh was asking it in a defiant way. If you ask God, who is the Lord, in a defiant way, you should probably expect to not like the answer a lot. I'm just thinking aloud here. But if you want to know who he is and you really are exploring, God, who are you? I want to know you. That the Lord loves that, and he'll walk right up beside you and he'll introduce himself in a very loving way that you will be glad to know him. But if you ask him defiantly, I just say, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And so the critical issue focused around two questions, really. And the two questions are this: who is the Lord of the people? Who is the Lord of the people? Now, this question includes both Pharaoh and the Egyptians. It's fair to them as well. Who is the Lord of the people? Because that's the question that Pharaoh asked. Who is the Lord? And that's the question that God was going to get to. And the second question is, who are the people of the Lord? Now, this particular question applied primarily to the Hebrews, not so much to the Egyptians, because there were several Hebrews, if you remember, as soon as God begins to drive that wedge between the Egyptians and the Israelites, there were several Israelites who got a little beat up. And the first thing they started doing was complaining, God, why are you doing this to us? You've made us an abhorrence in the sight of the Egyptians. And the problem was they weren't the people of the Lord. They really were the people of Pharaoh, some of them. And so this is a very important question. Who are the people of the Lord? And so with the conflict over lordship comes, not surprisingly, hostility. You have these two lords, or at least these two people who believe they're lords, asserting lordship over the same group of people. That doesn't work. And so the hostility that flows is something to be expected. And so if God is going to make a claim of lordship, which he was making, he is going to have to enforce that claim. He is going to have to force the issue because Pharaoh is unconvinced that the Lord is the Lord. He thinks he is the Lord. And so God's going to have to enforce his claim, which was his intention right from the beginning. We read that all along. Having the advantage, because he does and did, he fires his broadside first. And that's where we find ourselves then in Exodus. 1 Corinthians would have really gotten us lost, wouldn't it? In Exodus chapter 7. So let me begin in verse 14, and we're going to read down through 25. I have a little bit of commentary along the way, and then we'll start looking at kind of the casualties that unfold from this. So the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. Pharaoh was unwilling to have God as the Lord over him. Further, Pharaoh was unwilling to let God be the Lord over the Hebrews, because as far as he was concerned, who was Lord of the Hebrews? Pharaoh was. Bottom line. And so God said, look, Pharaoh, he's not willing to let me be Lord. He's not willing to follow instructions. So verse 15, go to Pharaoh in the morning when he goes out to the water, and you shall stand by the river's bank to meet him. And the rod which was turned to a serpent you shall take in your hand. For that, you got to go back to chapter 4. We just kind of talked and played with that today. But you definitely, there's references here you have to go back to read. So he says, take this rod that was turned into a serpent and go to him in verse 16. You shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed, until now, you would not hear. God says you're not listening. Thus says the Lord in verse 17, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. What is the this? What he's about to do. By what's going to follow now, you are going to know that I am the Lord. You ask who I am, let me introduce myself. My business cards will kill you. Literally. He says, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. And by definition, Pharaoh, you are not. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood. Now this is still God telling Moses what he's going to tell Pharaoh. Strike the rivers, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that are in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink the water out of the river. And so God said, you're going to hit the river with a stick, and I'm going to turn the Nile River into blood. Now, this is kind of gross. Let's just be real honest. How many of you love to see blood? Some of you do in a movie, but if you see it in real life, you pass out. So I'm not sure how that helps. But so I'm going to turn the entire river into blood. Now, notice what he didn't say. I'm going to turn the river red. Okay. Well, I just say this because there's some people who go, oh, it was a red algae bloom in the Nile River. How many of you have swum in any water around here? Whether you go down to Rhode Island, you go out to, we went to, was it Horse Neck, Goose Neck, whatever, one of those neck beaches. And we went out there, and guess what was there? Red tide. Okay, so I have swum with these red algae they're saying are blooming there. Has you ever gone out there and go, wow, I think I'm stepping in blood? Blood has a slightly different consistency than water, right? Just a little bit, kind of like syrup, but not Yeah. It's just so it's completely different. God didn't say, I'm going to throw out an algae bloom. I'm not going to turn the water ready. I'm going to turn the water into blood. I'm going to transform the water into something it's not cause the algae that's in it to like bloom up. Now I've seen it in Rhode Island. Sometimes you go down there to the beaches when red tide is really good, and right as the water's breaking in, the white surf kind of turns pinkish and reddish. Not blood, though. Never blood. Never have I gone, oh, that looks like it's like the ocean's bleeding. It just doesn't happen. And so God said, I'm going to turn the Nile River into blood. The fish in the Nile River are going to die, and the people who depend upon the Nile River for water are not going to be able to get a drink. So this is a pretty significant thing. The Nile River is, after all, in the nation of Egypt, and Egypt is in the middle of the desert, right. And so no water for 7 days is a bit problematic. Blood baking under the hot desert sun for 7 days is going to smell awesome. And rotting fish in the heat for 7 days is just fab. It's a broadside after all. Verse 18. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron. Now, we're getting this all down. Say to Aaron, take your rod and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their streams, over their rivers, over their ponds, and over all their pools of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in buckets of wood and pitchers of stone. So this plague is not just on the Nile River. Moses tells Aaron, okay, now go stretch out this rod over anything that looks like water. And so not only is the Nile River now flowing with blood, but so are the lakes in the Nile River Delta area. So are all the oases on the east and west side of the Nile. So are all the water that they already had in buckets and pitchers. Everything is turned to blood. So when you say, water to blood, we think Nile. This is like everything. I mean, bloody mess. And so this goes over, and it goes over the entire land of Egypt. He says there's blood in all of Egypt. And that's significant because where did all the Hebrews currently live? In Egypt. Up in the Nile River Delta, most of them. But all of the lakes in the Nile River Delta were blood, not water. So this is all the land. Because again, the question is, who is the Lord of the people? And who are the people of the Lord? And God needed to separate the Egyptians and the Israelites. And by throwing this at them, while the Egyptians would turn away from God, it would tend to cause the Jews, the Hebrews, to turn toward God. And so the responses would be different in this same plague. Everybody was about to get thirsty because God didn't turn down the sun or anything. It's just still hot desert, and now there's no water. Verse 20. And Moses and Aaron did so just as the Lord commanded. So he lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. So everybody could see what's going on. Let you know this is from God. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood, just the way God said it was going to happen. Verse 21, the fish that were in the river died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the river. So there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. This is gross. Now we've gone from God saying it's going to happen to it happening, and this is now the new reality that the Egyptians are living through. Verse 22, now it gets really smart. Verse 22, then the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments. And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, as the Lord has said. Now, how much sense does this make to you? Just think for a second. Be Pharaoh for a moment. Somewhere they find fresh water because God has pretty much turned everything to blood at this point, but they managed to procure some fresh water. So he turns to his magicians and say, okay, you do that. Here, I got this last cup of water. Can you turn it to blood too? Okay, genius, right? Because you might want that glass of water in 3 days. But he says, hey, can you, so the magicians of Egypt, they are able to do the same thing, not nearly on the same scale that God did. The Nile River was already gone, the lakes, pools, ponds, oases, already done. God left them just enough fresh water to be stupid with. And they were stupid with it. Isn't that how God, I said we pick on them, but sometimes it kind of happens the same way to us, doesn't it? He gave us just enough rope to help hang myself, and so I did. And so Pharaoh's heart becomes increasingly hardened toward God because, look at, my magicians are just as powerful as God is. I'm still the Lord. I can still do the same tricks. Not on the same scope, not on the same scale. We get that, but I still got it. And so Pharaoh, in his arrogance and in his humanity and his lordship, goes, yeah, I can do that too. Watch. Now we're all going to be thirsty. Verse 23, and Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither was his heart moved by this. So all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink. So they're digging everywhere they can in the desert looking for water because they could not drink the water of the river. And 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the river. So this plague lasted for a total of 7 days. They've got blood instead of water. It's a good thing that God made a kind of a terminal point on this plague, because if God hadn't turned the water back on, how long would the Egyptians have survived trying to figure out how to drink blood? Not real long. I mean, I guess you can do it. You're going to throw it all back up, but you know, whatever. Lunch should be tasty, right? And so you have this 7-day plague, this 7-day broadside. Now let's think in terms of casualties. What kind of casualties were there in this broadside? And we call this Gods at War because one of the things that we don't often think about or see is that you have Pharaoh and you have the Egyptians, and they have this entire pantheon of gods that they worshipped. And they, you know, gods were gods, and they were all kind of equal and equally bad, but equal. And, you know, you had some hierarchy, but, you know, gods were gods and people were people. And here comes the Lord going, no, your gods are as meaningless to me as your Pharaoh is. And so there is this part of this conflict is not just between God and Pharaoh, but between God and the pantheon of Egypt. And so we see several casualties in this, the first of which is Pharaoh. You may or may not know, but in Egyptian culture in this time, Pharaoh was considered a god. Not even a demigod. Not like, you know, Hercules was the you know, son of a god and a woman who came together, and so you get a demigod. Pharaoh was actually just considered a god. And part of Pharaoh's responsibility as God king was to make sure that the Nile River flowed and did everything that the Nile River was supposed to do. And so here comes Moses in the sight of Pharaoh. I think it's significant that Pharaoh got to see this happen. Pharaoh, as a god, fell down on the job. Pharaoh, as a god, failed in the onslaught of God's broadside because he couldn't keep the Nile River turned to water. He could turn some of it to blood. That was fantastically helpful. But he couldn't turn it back to water. And so the god Pharaoh failed. Beyond that, there is the god Ash, and we have a few gods I want to get through. Ash was depicted as a human with the head of a desert creature, alternately a lion, vulture, a hawk, or a snake. Ash was associated with the god Set, but he was the god of the oases west of the Nile. And so the fact that God made sure that all of those freshwater supplies on either side of the Nile were turned to blood, Ash, who was supposed to be the guardian, the god of the oases on the western side of the Nile, falls by the wayside. There was another minor god named Ha, same business. There was the god Khnum, who was depicted with the head of a ram, a human with the head of a ram. Khnum was actually one of the oldest of the Egyptian deities and was the god of the source of the Nile River. So you think about it, the Nile River flows which way? South to north, the only major river in the world to flow from south to north. And so Upper Egypt is actually in the south and Lower Egypt is actually in the north. It will spin your head around thinking about it. But the Nile River has its source in the mountains of Africa. And so you have Khnum, who was the god of the source of the Nile River. And suddenly the Nile River wasn't water anymore, it was blood. And the god Khnum was not making sure that the water was water that the people could use. You have the goddess Tefnut, and she was depicted as a human with the head of a lioness. Tefnut was the goddess of water and moisture. Anything that was water, anything that was moisture was in her domain and her purview. And now the water and the moisture and all the fresh water in all the land had been turned into blood, and there was nothing she could do about it. There was another god called Wajwer. I'm probably messing up the pronunciation of that one. I need a vowel to get it right. But Wajwer was often portrayed carrying the ankh and a loaf, and sometimes pregnant, which for a god is pretty impressive. But Wajwer was the god of the Mediterranean Sea and all of the lakes of the Nile River Delta. And so those lakes that were in the Nile River Delta, those were his deal. And they were now blood, not water. And there was nothing he could do about it. There was the two bigger gods that we see come into play here. The goddess Hetmehit, who was depicted either as a fish or as a woman with a symbol of a fish on her head. And Hetmehit was the goddess of the fish. But what did all the fish do? They died because fish can't breathe blood. They breathe water. And so here was Hetmehit, powerless to do anything to save the fish alive because God turned the water to blood and they all died. And then the major god that we see hit in this is actually the god Hapi. Now Hapi, I guess is happy, H-A-P-I, Hapi was depicted, this is great, he was depicted as a chubby blue genie, sometimes a pair of genies, with long green hair, wearing a loincloth. Awesome. I was going to try to get pictures of the Egyptian gods and put them up here, but I can't. Turns out pornography is not new. And I just didn't figure that would work well in church. So we'll leave the pictures off and we'll just describe them to you. So he was a chubby blue genie with long green hair and a loincloth. Awesome. Among his titles were Lord of the Fishes and Birds of the Marshes and Lord of the River bringing vegetation. The most ancient name of the Nile River was Hapi. Same thing, Hapi, H-A-P-I. And so ancient Egyptians didn't call it Nile, they called it Hapi. And the god who was primarily responsible for the flooding, the inundation of the Nile River every year was the god Hapi. He was the one who was the main one that took the fall in this. And so I would call these your kind of cultic casualties, 7 gods in one braza, boom, that just all proved very powerful against God, didn't they? Not exactly. But most of us, that's great information. It's interesting. It's not helpful. Think about the Nile River for a second. Is it possible to overstate the importance of the Nile River? Is it possible to overstate the importance of the Nile River? I mean, the reality is, if there is no Nile River, there is no Egypt. That's how critical the Nile River is. Because what is the land? What is the region? Desert. And so you have this water into a desert. If you don't have water, are people going to gather there in great numbers? No, not unless they want to die in equally great numbers. You just don't do it. And so the Nile River is there. You think about the dirt through which the Nile River flows is virtually sterile. The desert sands, I mean, the reason nothing grows in the desert is 1, because there's no water, but 2, there's no life, there's no nutrients. You can pour buckets and buckets and gallons of water in the desert, as happened, last week in our own Southwest. Did anything sprout up? No. Why? Because sand is sand. There's nothing can live in it. And so one of the great things about the Nile River is every year the Nile River floods. As the ice and stuff melt up in the upper Egypt, it comes down and it brings with it fertile silt that it deposits all along the Nile River Valley. And so on either side of the Nile River, during flood stage, you've got a lot of water, but it's also depositing this soil that's very nutrient rich. And once the flood waters abate, then you can plant right along that way, because instead of dirt, or instead of sand, now you have dirt. And it's nutrient rich and it's fertile for, like a mile on either side of the Nile, not very far. Then it goes back to desert again. Egypt would not exist, could not exist without the Nile River. It isn't a matter of the Nile makes life nice in Egypt. The Nile River makes life possible in Egypt. And by striking at the Nile River, God struck at what made living possible. Had he not tempered that plague, would life have continued? No. He struck at the very core of what made living possible there. And at this point, it becomes very practical for us, because we can't relate really to the god of Hapi and his genie and his loincloth. We just don't do that. Anybody ever go to the temple of Hapi? Anybody ever worship a fish goddess? Yeah, I mean, we just don't get that part of it other than historical interest, oddities and interesting things. But the reality is, can any of us relate to elements in our life that make living possible? Now, not nice, but I mean living are there things in your life that if they're not there, you just cease to be able to exist? Okay? My first thought is a job. How many of you have a job? All right, how many of you are underpaid? Just keep those hands up. In this economy, be glad you have a job, right? But if you did not have a job, would you be able to continue living? I'm assuming your pulse would continue, but you'd get hungry in a hurry, wouldn't you? And so the things that you need to make life possible, you need a job. You need money. That's why you go to work. Some of us work because we love our job. Some of us work because we need money. On a really good day, you both love your job and need money. But at the end of the day, it's a job, and if they stop paying you, you stop showing up, right? So we need money. You need an education to live. It's helpful, though I guess not required, to have a modicum of health in order to be able to live. You want to be healthy. That's why we go to doctors, have universal health care that doesn't work real well, but it beats like running around to witch doctors and stuff, I guess. So we need health, at least to some degree. We need family. How many of you are really good living life in complete and total isolation with no identity and nobody to share it with? Most of us aren't, and so we need family, we need moms, we need dads, we need brothers, we need sisters, we need kids. Well, we need moms and dads anyway. I'm kidding. I don't want to offend my kids either. We need friends, we need a car to get where we're going. There are a lot of things in life that aren't niceties, they're not luxuries, they're things that we really need to have in order to be able to live. If you don't have a house, for instance, come wintertime, it gets a bit cold in New England. You should probably start walking south right now if you don't have a house. Because by the time the cold weather gets here, you might be someplace where it's warm, I'm not sure. But there are things that we simply need, and there are other things that we think we need in order to live. And it's not a matter of the good life. Having a house that doesn't leak and keeps the cold out and the warm in, that's not the good life. That's just life. Having enough money to pay your bills with isn't the good life. The good life is having more than that. Most of us are just slightly on the south side of that equation. But we need to have money in order. So these aren't luxuries. These are necessities. But for some people, these necessities become a god. And that's where we begin to really relate. Now, the ancient Egyptians, they literally worshiped the river. But the river represented necessity that they needed. We may not worship or think we worship necessity, and yet some people do. They see a job as a god. They see a car as a god. They see their family as a god. They see their friends as a god. They see their wealth as a god. They see there are a lot of these things that we need that very quickly become gods. And before you say, Pastor, that's not me, I would never do that. How many of you are thinking that? Let's be honest. Let's think for a second, what is a god? Historically, gods have a couple of things that are true about them. Two primary roles that they play. First of all, they receive attention, passion, and adoration. A god is something that receives your attention, your passion, and your adoration. And secondly, a god is something that provides you with identity and direction. Now think about your job for a second, especially if you like your job. Does your job receive your attention, your passion, maybe even your adoration? Does your job provide for you identity and direction? Then historically speaking, your job could be a god because it fulfills the same roles that a god would. Historically speaking, any of the necessities that we've talked about and any that you've come to mind since that we didn't mention, any one of those things could be a god to you. If they receive your attention, your passion, your adoration, and they provide to you identity and direction, they are a god. You worship them. And that's scary. Because God said, you shall have no other gods before me. Nothing between you and me. And so you think about God for a second, because the question is, who is the Lord, right? Does God get more of your attention, passion, and adoration than your job does if you love your job? Or your girlfriend or your boyfriend, your spouse, your kid? Because I've seen parents that worship their children. You worship their car. Ladies, you fill in the blank, because I don't know what it is you worship at that level. Nothing quite so visceral, probably. More subtle. Maybe chocolate. That's a tough one. Chocolate's good. I'm not going to mess with chocolate. I don't bash chocolate. Chocolate and I have too good a relationship. But could it become a god? You see the subtlety in our life. Necessity is an important thing. And do we need a house? Do we need a job? Do we need a car? Do we need these things? Yes. But when we need these things more than we need God, guess what we just set up? A brand new religion, a Ford or Chevy. Pontiac's already dead, so I guess that's out. You know, a new religion of your company name, whatever it is. And so before we pick on too harshly the ancient Egyptians and say, you know, who is the Lord? See, God is the Lord and God is our God. Okay, God is our God, but he may not be your Lord. You may actually worship a necessity more than you worship God, and that's scary, or it should be to you. Because work, family, these necessities, they do get a bulk of our attention, don't they? They do get a bulk of your life. I mean, I spend 10 hours a day between commuting and at time at work. 10 hours of every day of my life, every weekday of my life is work. I get that. You know, and why do I go to work? Because I have 6 kids and they're all addicted to food. If I could break that addiction, I think I could maybe back off a little bit. Oh yeah, then there's my addiction to food. And so work could become, and for many people has become, their God. And so the question is, who is the Lord of the people? Because the reality is the Hebrew people were as reliant on the Nile River as the Egyptian people were. This wasn't something that applied just to the Egyptians. The Hebrew people needed the water coming off the Nile River just as much. They could either turn to Pharaoh as the Lord, or they could turn to God as the Lord. Now here's the thing. What did God promise the Hebrew people? Do you remember? I'm going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now that's an odd reference, because I don't know about you, but I've never bathed in either of those two things. I've never seen any of that just running down the street. I guess unless you have, you know, like a milk truck that has an accident, you might get a little bit of milk flowing. But routinely you don't get that. But it's a metaphor. Milk is something of a necessity. The human body requires calcium and the things that come from milk, just like water is a necessity. And you may not like milk, but you may get it in cheese, cottage cheese, vitamin D, supplements, whatever. Calcium supplements. You need these things. Milk represents a necessity. Honey, on the other hand, you can live your entire life without anything sweet and you'd be fine. Honey represents a nicety. And so God says, I'm going to take you from a land where you get only your necessity, and I'm going to take you to a land where you have necessity and you have nicety. Take you to a land where you have your needs met and you have some of those things that you want, some of those finer things in life. I'm going to do those too. Not just what you need, but some of what you want. The question that God put before his people, though, was which were they going to choose? Were they going to choose to be the people of Pharaoh, or were they going to choose to be the people of God? Were they going to choose to worship necessity, or would they take a chance on God, who promised to meet their needs and some of their wants? He promised to fill them and to fulfill them. So the choice was up to them. Who is Lord of the people, and who are the people of the Lord? Those same questions ring true in our lives today. When you think about necessities of life, and they're there, do you worship the necessity and the obtaining of the necessity? Or do you worship God and rely on him to provide and to meet your needs? Now, I'm not saying quit your job and just spend all day here at church. Bad idea. God said to work, but God said to worship him not your job. God said to worship him, not your family. God said to worship him, not the procurement of goods. And so it's a subtle distinction, but where's your heart? Where's your energy? Where's your passion? Where's your identity? Where's your direction? If it comes from God, you still spend a lot of time at work, you're probably okay. But if it comes from work and you hang out at church once a week for an hour a week, you're probably not okay. And you should really think this question: who is the Lord of the people? And who are the people of the Lord? Father, we love you today. We thank you for this plague. Goodness, it's horrible to think about thanking you for blood turned to water. And yet, it highlights for us, living these many millennia later, our human tendency to elevate necessity and the procurement of the things that we need to a level that competes with and even in our own hearts and minds overshadows you. God, it's a dangerous place to be. It's a place where we, like Pharaoh, are going to be introduced to you in a kind of hostile way if we're not careful. You've promised that if we would be your people, that you would meet our needs and you would meet our wants, that you would fill our bellies and you would fulfill our lives. Father, help us to look to you as Lord. Help us to be your people. Father, help us to look at a world around us that is in large part gone completely stark raving mad. And bring a moment of sanity because our lives are oriented toward you as our God and lived out in that way. And may that be a great testimony to the people around us, that you love them, that you want them to be your people, that you want to meet their needs and their wants as well. God, help us to be your people, we pray in Jesus' good name. Amen.